All right, I think we are ready to go. So, first of all, welcome everyone. It's great to see you here this morning. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Thank you to the panel members that are here with us this morning, and my co-host in Vancouver, Kaya Dupuis. Thank you for spending your time here with us this morning. My name is Chris Kilford. I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria, and we're on Vancouver Island. And I am joined today by Kaya. Kaya was originally part of my team in Victoria and is now a member of the CIC Vancouver Executive Committee and recently graduated from the University of Victoria with a BA honors in political science. So Kaya, welcome to you. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations.
And I'm joining you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples that include the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
Now, for those of you that are not familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven organization with the express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's role in a very changing, as you would know, international landscape. And what makes us quite unique, I think, for many of the other organizations like us across the country is that we do have 20 branches in Canadian cities, big and small, from Whitehorse to St. John's. And you can find more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council, and Kaya will also put a link into the chat section so that you can connect with us more easily. Now, our discussion today will be followed by an audience Q&A. And I'd ask that if you have any questions for our audience members, you use the chat function at the bottom. Please write your questions there, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. And we're also recording this event so that it can eventually go up on our CIC YouTube channel. Now, as you know, we're here this morning to speak about a brand new book, Fulfilling the Promise of Canada, Charting a National Strategy for an Unstable World, in which a very distinguished group of military, intelligence, academic, and policy thinkers examine the hard realities of an increasingly unstable world and ask what Canada must do to meet the challenges that we will face. The book is quite extensive with 20 authors covering everything from air power, land, sea, naval strategy, the reserve military forces in our country, special ops, foreign intelligence, and then into other subjects like Arctic security and digital vulnerability, higher education needs, a turn to China, Taiwan, and also, of course, importantly, the future of Canada-US relations. So what we will do today is, first of all, we're going to speak with our panel members, but let me introduce them. And I'd like to start with Chuck Oliviero here in Victoria, who holds a PhD and served in the military for a very, very long time. He's a former Army officer, PhD in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada, and very active with the Royal United Services Institute here in Victoria. We were also joined today by Lieutenant General retired E. Thibault. He's also a former Army officer who served as Canada's Vice Chief of Defence Staff from 2013 to 2016, and he is the past president of the Conference of Defence Associations, a position he held for almost 9 years, up until very recently when he handed it over in May 2026. I'm delighted that we have Narendra Patchkade with us here. Narendra, thank you for joining us this morning. He is a Commonwealth Fellow, a writer, critic, and essayist working across philosophy, art history, literature, politics, and global affairs. His work brings an interdisciplinary lens to questions of culture, historical consciousness, power, and moral responsibility in modern public life. He is also the author of Form is History, When History No Longer Requires Us. It's a meditation on the changing place of history in contemporary political and cultural experience. It's a new book that he has. And last but not least, Dr. Joel Holtke, he holds a PhD in political science from Harvard University and is a Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the Royal Military College of Canada. And among many other appointments, he is a Senior Fellow at the Queen's University Centre for International and Defence Policy. And a plug for the CIDP, I'm a fellow there as well. So it's great to have you here, Joel, with us this morning. So let's get started. And the first question that we're going to have this morning is to Chuck, because in many ways, Chuck and I'm sure you'll talk about your colleague Phil, were instrumental in getting this book together, to bringing so many authors together, because as I'm sure the audience members know, it's not an easy task to undertake something like this. And so, Chuck, from your perspective, what was the catalyst? What was the idea? What were the challenges that you faced in bringing everybody together to create this superb book?
Thanks for the question, Chris, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for tuning in, as it were. So the book was originally conceived by Phil, my publisher and friend, and me, as a vehicle that was originally going to be purely military, because he's also a retired Army officer, and we were concerned that the Canadian military had gone into a bit of a decay. And we thought, well, we should maybe reach out to friends and colleagues, people that we know, for their opinions. We were thinking about this before the election. The election changed everything in so many ways, because we were originally thinking that we would make this something for the new defense minister, who we had an inkling of who it might be had it been a conservative government. And then we got Mr. Carney, who, although I'm not a liberal, is doing a fabulous job, I must say. Personally, I think so. And he started throwing money at the military and at other Canadian institutions. And so Phil and I thought, well, let's get this book off the ground and let's go further afield. So I went through my Rolodex and asked a bunch of people. And then to go wider, I reached out to you, and you gave me a bunch of high-priced help, and I asked all those people, and I think I think I asked 23 people to write essays, and we got 20, which is, well, 21 actually, because we got an introduction written by Professor Philip Lagasse, whom I know, and he didn't want to write an essay, he wanted to write the introduction, so that was great. And but we put really um, sort of iron ring restrictions on all the authors. It couldn't be longer than 2,500 words. We gave them the shortest of timelines. I think I gave everybody 60 days to get their draft to me. And we only had one person who couldn't meet the deadline. And, that was fine, because as I was editing the ones I did get, the final author managed to finish, because, of course, everybody we asked was already busy doing something else. And normally, when you ask someone to do something like this as an anthology, you give them a year. We gave them 60 days.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody wrote on what I gave them a general area and asked them to give us their thoughts. We didn't restrict what they said. And a couple of people felt that maybe they were less qualified than they should be, and I disagreed. That's why I reached out to them, and everybody wrote what I consider to be outstanding essays, with the possible exception of the essay that I contributed. But everybody else, I think, really knocked it out of the park. I was quite thrilled by it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, if you buy the book, the royalties are being given to the Royal United Services Institute. We're splitting those. Half will go to the Victoria chapter, which I'm a part of the executive, and half will go to the St. John, New Brunswick chapter, of which Phil is a member. So nobody got paid. That was the other nice thing. We said, we want you to do this. We want you to do it fast. And by the way, we're not paying you. And everybody stepped up anyway. It was great.
Yeah, it was very well constructed. The two parts, and the second part, I thought, really tackled key topic that we're talking about all the time. China, Taiwan. You had George Takat on Taiwan, and he has a new book out inspired by Taiwan. So it was very timely to have him. And of course, the Canada-US piece. We're talking about that all the time. So it hit the right chord with a wide audience. That was clear to me when I was reading the book. What I'll do now is I'll turn to Guy, because Guy, you were one of the contributors to the book, and I will tell you that I muted everybody to make sure that the sound was good for everybody. So Guy, if you could unmute yourself as we're moving along, thank you. And your chapter was called "The Armed Forces Canada Needs: Hard Power in a Time of Rupture," and you mentioned Prime Minister Carney's Davos speech in earlier this year, and of course it's been resonating all across the world. That's clear, and much of it was, a lot of it was really saying to us that we need a military. I think where hard power, we're in a world where hard power increasingly matters. And so I wanted to ask you, do you think with the increased funding and the new defense and investment strategy, and certainly with you saw the announcement this morning on the submarines, that Canada's finally stepping up on the defense file? And so that would be the first part. Are we finally stepping up? It seems we are. But then later on in the chapter, I thought what you spoke about was even more important, especially to me, and that was this whole idea of service before self. That this is speaking to a revitalized Canadian forces. It's not just about new capabilities, but it's about this sense of putting yourself before other things. And so, could you just sort of elaborate your thinking behind the chapter and on those two particular points?
Yes, well, thanks, Chris, for that. It's great to be here with everyone, and I appreciate Chuck reaching out to me and putting me under the screws there to get my my thoughts together, because my initial drafts were a lot more than 2,500 words, and because there's a lot to be said, I think, about where the Canadian forces are in a world which I think increasingly, as the chapter kind of refers, is hard power. I think matters in ways that many politicians, perhaps in the risks that we've taken over the years, didn't see the necessity. So I think the very first thing I'd like to say is, is Canada taking the issues of investing in our armed forces and in hard power and in the security institutions seriously? I think so far so good. The fact that you've got the Prime Minister himself expressing kind of views on these issues is, I think, quite different from all of our experiences. For those who have served in uniform, to see a Prime Minister leading the way in discussing the importance of our armed forces and why it matters to Canadians. And so, from that perspective, I do think that we are seeing a stepping up politically around the issues of security and defense. But I think the broader picture is, are Canadians with us? And I think that they are, as far as it goes, because I don't think that the penny yet has dropped about, if we're going to achieve 3.5% of GDP on defense, core defense spending, and 5% of GDP on broader adjacent kind of investments in the broader security and defense of Canada. I don't think the penny has really dropped on what the sacrifices are going to be in order to sustain that level of investment. So I think that the government has yet to be really transparent about some of what those sacrifices might need to be. But I think that that's at least starting from a point where I think Canadians are seeing the importance of investing in areas where I think they recognize that we have really taken our eye off the ball. The third part of the equation about Canadians is really, I think, the machinery of government. And here I'm a little bit less enthusiastic, because I think that the system that we've built over many years in terms of acquiring capabilities and the risks that the government has been willing to take, and the bureaucracy I think is kind of sclerotic and has been quite risk adverse, very process bound. I haven't seen a lot of changes yet in terms of how the machinery is going to be adjusted to actually deliver on the ambition. So, I think it's good as far as it goes. It doesn't go far enough, but I think if you're in the defense and security space right now, you've got to be hopeful. You've got to say, let's get behind all of this. And I don't see any reason why Canada can't actually deliver on the ambition that the government has set out. To the back end of the question that you referred to, because I do, I think when we hear about modernization of our armed forces, what needs to be done, we immediately go to all the capabilities, and that's the equipment, and it's the defense investments, and it's going to be the defense investment strategy and a new relationship with defense industry. And I'm all for that, and I think that we clearly need to get our act together in terms of equipping the Canadian Armed Forces with the systems that they need, the modern systems that are relevant to, as we see combat changing in many places in the world, which gives us a very good model of what we need our Canadian Armed Forces to be able to do at home and abroad. But I do think that what I was really getting at here is that our investments in people and the members of the armed forces has to be kind of the centerpiece of the investments that Canada is making in our future of the armed forces. And I do think that if we kind of look at the last decade and a half, there's been a lot of taking the eye off the ball about the core raison d'etre of why you actually have the armed forces. And ultimately, it's the application of the state's hard power, its military means to achieve our international obligations, and of course to deter and to protect Canada. And I believe that when it comes to the issues of the warrior spirit and the importance of members of the Canadian Forces joining a profession, I have to say that anyone who's been following the issues of the Canadian Forces in the last few years, with our focus on issues of making sure that bad behaviors are rooted out, that we focus on individuals' rights and the freedoms of the members. It also comes, the other part is really with the obligation of members who are joining this profession to hold themselves to account for their actions, to maintain their fitness, to do their intellectual work, to make sure that they're expert in their areas. It's not just a job, it's a profession. And I think we have to really reinforce that as we kind of go forward. And there's a number of chapters in this book that touch on this, including Chuck's piece, the Howard Coombs, talking a little bit about the intellectual basis of our armed force. And I think this is a really important thing for us to not lose sight of as we're focused on new capabilities of submarines and F-35s and modern land force capabilities. I think it's really the centerpiece is our people.
And I'm mindful here that many of us on the Zoom panel here have military service, and we're retired now. We're bringing in new capabilities. And these capabilities will be manned by many young Canadians going forward. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Kaya for a question to you, Guy, about your chapter.
Yeah, so for young Canadians who've never really had to think about war or fight in a Canadian conflict, what is the answer to the question of why should we care about hard power right now? And then the second part to my question is you talked about sacrifices. So what sacrifices do you think young Canadians should be expected?
Kaya, if we were having this conversation over a beer someplace, I'd turn it right back on you and you tell me why you think hard power matters. But I'll take the first shot and then maybe you can see if it resonates. Well, I think first and foremost, Canadians, I think, are peaceable people. And from the perspective of Canadians and our view of the world, we'd all, I think, in fact, everybody on this call, I'm sure, would all like to live in a world where conflict and wars were not happening. And so I think the very first answer, I think, to why hard power matters is that it's an insurance for making sure that Canada is protected, that we protect our own sovereignty, that we live up to our international obligations, and that's including our alliance obligations with our NATO partners, but also is contributing to international peace and security, where the system that we benefit from in terms of our prosperity and our economy and our ability to really take what makes Canada great and be able to operate in a functioning international system is for all of those members to kind of live up to their obligations, and that is, I think, important for Canada. So it's kind of like it's analogous, I think, to why we have fire departments and why we have police departments. It's there to ensure that we have capabilities to respond to that which is kind of perhaps preventable. But when it's not prevented, that we've got something to respond to. So in the first instance, I think that our investments in hard power is as part of Canada's deterrence to make sure that Canada's those who would either wish us harm or do us harm or take advantage of Canada, that they're deterred in doing that. And we do that in a couple of different ways through our own capabilities, but I think also, of course, through our collective security, our collective defense, and that is including with our United States allies in protecting North America. So I think it's a bit of a question to kind of turn it on its head and to say, of course, if you didn't have these kind of capabilities, what would you actually be vulnerable to? And so I think that that's what we've got to be focused on here as we look at a world where we see countries that are using their power against neighbors and against those that they have either geopolitical differences with, ideological differences with. It could be also protecting from the issues of transnational organized crime and cyber crime. And so, Canada, we ought not to take the peace and the prosperity that we have for granted. It needs to be protected, and so I think that would be kind of my take on why this matters in a world that's changing really quite rapidly around us. And I think in your own generation, I think you're not oblivious to the challenges that we've got, whether it be in issues like cyber crime and seeing all of the ills that we're getting with respect to the introduction of technologies which can be used for great harm as well, whether it be AI, robotics, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know, does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, it does. It's a great answer.
Thank you.
Going to move on to Narendra. I'm going to got a question for you, and Kaya will as well. And as a reminder to the audience, you can put the questions, if you like, into the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll get to those in due course. And so, Narendra, I was quite excited about your chapter. Of course, I think we're all watching the World Cup. We've all seen how tremendously well the Canadian team did and how it has brought Canadians together from coast to coast to coast. And your chapter was called When Nationhood Fails, The Vanishing We and National Interest. And in it, you noted this lack of shared political interest in Canada, and that in effect that we've become post-national, yet without having built the kind of nationhood that can sustain national interest. And as you say, and this is a quote from your chapter, a state cannot rank obligations unless it knows who it speaks for and what burdens it can legitimately ask its citizens to bear. And the remedy that you noted in your chapter was this creation of a new national story. I read your chapter as a lament for the nation. Because you had referenced George Grant's essay, his book actually in 1965. So could you sort of expand on that chapter for us today, this sense I had, this lament for a nation and what a new national story for Canada would look like? And I've muted you, Narendra, so if you would unmute.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
And thanks, Jack, for the invite to contribute. And with the invite, actually, I was just kind of perturbed in a way. What kind of a vantage point do I take to contribute to the prospective book then? And since I have been quite involved with kind of developing a critique of the realist school within a very scholarly tradition of international relations, I was very much working with the French scholars who are recent works, Bertrand, Badi's Beyond Power and War, the mysterious social energy, which focuses inwards within the society and the state. And that actually led me to one of a very axiomatic kind of conversation that I had with General Rick Hillier, where he spoke about something very interesting, which has always stuck with me, and I have placed it somewhere. And it was about, he was alluding to the idea of what assumptions we are making and what assumptions that we don't know that we are making is so critical to understanding of reality, and how that actually kind of drives the understanding or even simple thing as decision making, or simple thing, not simple, more profound and morally challenging, of asking someone to go to war. So that was a kind of, those were the thoughts that I was caged in. And so when I started writing, and to your allusion to the term, the phrase, the lament of nation, of course, it is impossible to use in Canada without hearing George Grant behind it. But my lament is somewhat different from Grant's. I'm not mourning the loss of an older, purer Canada. I am asking whether Canada ever fully completed the work of becoming a nation in the first place. And this is more to develop. It's not some rhetorical argument. It is in a way to spur a certain kind of discourse-oriented activity. And so Canada has been very good at accommodations, procedure, moderation, and adjustment. And these are real achievements in a way. But they have allowed a plural country to live with certain civic peace, let's put it like that, or order. But the danger is that procedure becomes a substitute for purpose. We manage difference very well, but we hesitate when we have to imagine a common political horizon. And so basically, that is the heart of my concern. Foreign policy is not simply what happens outside the country. It depends on a political subject at home. A state cannot speak seriously of national interests unless it knows what it speaks for, what it owes, what it will defend, and what burdens it can legitimately ask citizens to bear. And so when I say Canada has become post-national without having built the nationhood that can sustain national interests, I mean that we have institutions, charters, codes, recognitions, procedures again, and moral vocabularies. But when a hard choice arrives, Gaza, Ukraine, China, indigenous sovereignty, pipelines, climate transition, Alberta alienation, Quebec nationalism, defense spending, procedure is suddenly asked to do the work of a national story. It cannot. And that's where the idea of politics actually enters. So a country can have policy without a national story. It cannot have a strategy. And that is the crux in a way. And that is why I think the question of a new national story is not sentimental. It is strategic. A national story is not not a myth of sameness. It cannot be racial, ethnic, imperial, or nostalgic in that sense. It has to begin with the unfinished reality of this country. Indigenous sovereignty treaties, Quebec immigration, plural cities, regional grievances, and the hard fact of living beside the United States. The all makes into a big basket case of the obvious facts that we face. So a new Canadian story would have to say we are a political community built from unfinished obligations. Our unity cannot come from sameness. It has to come from the capacity to bear burdens together. And that is a major political project. And this is where I would like to connect the chapter to the present moment. Something what I term as carnism. Carnisms interest me as an observer, as an academic, because it seems to restore the language of seriousness. For instance, sovereignty, defense, productivity, Arctic security, infrastructure, strategic autonomy, industrial capacity. But there is a danger here too. If national purpose is translated too quickly into investment, procurement, finance, and elite managerial competence, then the deeper political problems remain untouched. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that what we are actually witnessing is nothing but a financialization of a national purpose. Which is different from the deeper political problem that we all face. And so one cannot rebuild a country as a portfolio before we rebuild it as a polity. And this is also my critique of the Davos language. I am alluding to his speech. Davos can recognize a crisis. It can speak of rupture, uncertainty, strategic autonomy, and resilience. But those phrases do not by themselves create a people capable of sacrifice and shared obligation. So Davos can name rupture, it cannot manufacture a people. And so my lament, going back to your question, Chris, is not for a Canada that disappeared. It is for a Canada that must still be made. The question now is whether Canada can move from managed pluralism to shared purpose, from procedure to strategy, from portfolio to polity, and from Davos language to a really democratic nationhood. And that is why, as I said, carnism really interests me. It's a very interesting phase that we are all going through. And in that sense, it is an answer to the drift I described. But my question again is whether it is a political answer or a managerial one. And that is what we'll be kind of confronted with, and that is what perhaps hopefully I'll be able to extend it in the argument in one of the short book that I'm working on carnism, and in a larger project, Canada at the edge of its idea. The question behind both is very simple. Can Canada move from being a managed society to being a political community again?
Narendra, thank you for that. I'm going to turn over to Kaya because I know Kaya has a question for you. And then I'll circle around to our panel members in case you might have a question for Narendra on his chapter. Kaya, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. So in April of this year, I had conducted some research for the CIC on youth perspectives of Canadian identity and young people's role in the world. And so the conclusion that my research group found was that young Canadians do not necessarily associate their national identity with a shared race, a shared ethnicity, or grouping. Instead, Canadian identity is comprised of multiple backgrounds, which is truly what makes us Canadian. And so you write about this vanishing we in the sense that shared Canadian identity that once held us together is fragmenting. Another topic that my research group found is that there's this political rhetoric of Canadian values, but it's never really defined. And a lot of young people are confused when they hear this term being thrown around of, oh, this policy abides by Canadian values. There's no context behind it for young people to understand. So my question for you is for young Canadians who grew up in a diverse multicultural cities and feel proud of that. Does the idea of a stronger national identity appear as an asset or a threat? And can you have a national strategy without one?
That is an excellent question, Kaya, because it gets to the heart of the misunderstanding around national identity itself. So when I speak of the vanishing we, I'm not arguing for a return to a narrow ethnic, racial, or cultural homogeneous idea of Canada, as I just earlier mentioned. That would be intellectually wrong and politically impossible. Young Canadians are right to feel that Canada is made from multiple backgrounds, or in other words, sourcing themselves as Canadians from a very myriad range of uh, identities, so to say. In many ways, that is one of the country's greatest achievement. That option, that plurality at any given time. The problem begins when things like multiculturalism, I'm using things like because as a policy mechanism, because they become a substitute for a shared political story, which is not that palatable because then it falls within a managerial regime of managing the differences. A country cannot celebrate difference and still fail to answer the harder question, what do? We owe one another. For instance, those are the difficult questions that we are not able to either frame or able to pose to each other because we share a political home. So when we share that common home, are we able to pose these harder questions? And that is a question that a national identity has to answer. So I would say to young Canadians, the stronger national identity I am talking about should not feel like a threat to one's plurality. It should protect it by giving it a common civic ground. It should not ask you to become less plural. It should ask whether plurality can mature into a shared responsibility. And that transition is a big political project, and that has to happen. And this matters for foreign policy. When Gaza, Ukraine, China, India, climate change, pipelines issue, indigenous land, Alberta, Quebec, any of these defense spending, they enter public life. Canada cannot simply say we are diverse. Diversity is a fact. Strategy requires judgment. It requires the ability to rank obligations and explain why some costs must be borne together. And without that, even foreign policy file becomes a domestic legitimacy crisis. And we are seeing that. I mean, every international conflict becomes a referendum among moral publics. The state then manages sensitivities rather than articulating national purpose. The current issue at hand, the Human Rights Museum exhibition. And so, can you have a national strategy without a shared national identity? You have policies, you have announcements, you have procurement, summits, spending targets, and careful language. But strategy requires continuity, sacrifice, priorities, and consent. And those things require we. And that is the cardinal fact of it. And the challenge then is not to choose between multiculturalism and nationhood. The challenge is to turn multicultural Canada into a political community capable of acting in history. In other words, the question for young Canadians is not whether Canada should become less plural. It is whether pluralism can become capable of shared purpose. Without that, even a Carney-style strategic state will remain elite-led rather than democratically grounded.
Thanks, Kaya.
Brilliant.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Narendra. Thank you. For our other panel members, if you have a question for Narendra at this point, let me know. And if not, we'll push along to Joel. Thank you, Narendra, for your comments about your chapter. Joel, your chapter was called Canada-U.S. Relations in the Second Trump Term, and I noted and I wrote this down, and I quote from your chapter, ironically, for all those Canadians, past and present, about their country being invisible and inaudible in Washington, your time has come. So I thought that was so important to mention. But you speak to a measure of optimism in our relations with the United States. You speak about Albert Einstein's view of the United States in the 1950s. We had McCarthyism at the time and virulent anti-communism. And it was very unsettling. And no doubt the United States has gone through many unsettling periods over the last few decades. But I had the sense from reading your chapter that, Canadians and everyone else in the world outside of the United States, we need to remain buckled up for the near future, because we don't know where America is heading, and arguably much of their population doesn't as well. So what would you have, to you, Canada-US relations in the second Trump term? We're gathering in Ankara this week for the NATO summit. There's so much going on. Do you think perhaps in Ottawa they're hopeful for the midterms to go a certain way? I mean, how are we going to move forward out of this current situation we find ourselves?
Well, thank you. How we move forward depends on Americans. They will have to decide. I think the outcome of the midterms remains uncertain. But as I tried to argue in the paper, there's no certainty with the Trump administration. It's inconsistent. It's inconsistent from day to day. Canada seems to have risen to the top. Some days, the American national security agenda, and when you're on the top of that agenda, you're usually in trouble. And so it's hard to cope. It's going to be hard to cope with that. Even if the midterms go favor the Democrats, I think he's going to dig in one way or the other, because the Republicans are not putting up the sort of opposition that one would expect from lawmakers. As regards to what happens in the Ankara summit, it's possible that Trump, who's coming into the summit not with a strong hand, particularly because of Iran, will reach some agreement with the European allies and then turn around and focus again on Canada. After all, one of the national security statements was North American security, a rewriting of the Monroe Doctrine to the Trump Doctrine. What happens then? With regard to Prime Minister Carney, I agree with Chuck that he's done a very good job. The trouble is, there are realities that we can't escape. Our trade dependency with the United States, the bilateral nature of the security arrangements. Nor can I think we can rely on other so-called middle powers to join us in some sort of opposition to the United States, or rewriting of the international rules of engagement. I think that they will seek to reach their agreements with the United States and leave Canada sort of hanging in the wind. Now, it's possible that the Trumpism will go out of fashion, as McCarthyism did. At the same time, each president moves in a certain direction, and the succeeding administration doesn't always go back to before. So particularly on trade policy, we may see the toughness of the Trump administration continue. With regard to defense policy, we don't know what's going to happen with NORAD under any new construct for North American security. As someone once said, Americans have a habit of cooperating closely with Canada, and it has less to do with strategic necessity than a certain comfortableness. Certainly, Mr. Trump has broken that habit, so we don't know. And that's what I tried to put forward in the paper. That predictions, as Yogi Berra once said, predictions about the future are particularly difficult, particularly about the future. But for Canada, that future is coming sooner than it is for other countries. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Kaya, over to you for a question to Joel.
Thanks, Chris. So Canada has historically used its alliance commitments, such as NATO or NORAD, as a substitute for an independent foreign policy. So if those structures become less reliable or more conditional, what does Canada actually stand for on its own? And then I guess my overarching question within that question is that a question that my generation is equipped to answer and act on?
Well, if we just take NATO, the first NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay, said that NATO was there to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. For Canada, NATO was seen as a godsend because Canada could avoid having to choose between Europe and the United States, principally Britain and the United States. If NATO is weakened, then Canada's back where it was in the late 1940s. There is no, if there ever was, there is no counterweight. If there ever was, and it has to decide what it wants to do in terms of North American defense. And as I point out, actually, it's really just air defense. It's not missile defense. It's a narrow band of things that Canada does. Canadian foreign and defense policy has only made sense in the larger context. You take away that context, and it's hard to say what Canada stands for. And if I might, with regard to Canadian values, we stand for NATO values, but those are not unique to Canada. Canadian values are not unique to Canada. Liberty, free speech, democratic government. There's nothing unique there in what Canada stands for. Clifford Orwell, the University of Toronto, has pointed that out. What binds Canadians together is liberal democracy, but it's not that unique. So again, it's hard to identify some sort of purpose. Canada has been subject to criticism by the United States for not spending enough on defense, and it's trying to get up to 3%. On the other hand, in the post-Cold War era, Canada's been all over Europe. It was in the Balkans. It has troops. It has troops in the Baltic states now. The numbers are not great, but the contributions are there. The trouble that we have now is in Trump's calculations, that political symbolism doesn't mean that much anymore. And so we can say, oh yes, we have 2,000 troops in Latvia. It doesn't mean that much to him as it used to mean in the old alliance. So I think it'll be extremely difficult to find a place in the world outside those alliance contexts. We can call ourselves an Arctic nation until everybody else becomes interested in the Arctic, and then what are we?
Right. I think I'm going to actually expand on that and also bring Guy back into the conversation because Guy was speaking about sacrifices to make. And, you were talking about, are we really equipped to deal with these unpredictable situations? Well, I guess a question for both of you is, what are these sacrifices and unpredictable environments that young people are going to have to face, and are they equipped to deal with these situations?
Well, I think we are wealthy enough that we can afford more defense spending. But defense spending is not just to put hard power on the ground. Defense spending also has a highly symbolic characteristic. We spend to show our allies that we're committed. How much, the famous question of Robert McNamara, U.S. Secretary of Defense, was how much is enough? In Canada's case, it's been how much is just enough? How much do we need defense spending to quiet criticism from our allies? That's a more difficult case to argue. In the old NATO, we've gotten by, and with the minimal defense spending, so great sacrifices have not been asked, whether we can go beyond what we're doing now significantly. Sacrifices always has to do with, well, what are you sacrificing? Are you sacrificing more money for healthcare? Are you sacrificing more money for education? Those are the really hard questions that we may have to ask in the future. And so the link between a prosperous economy and being able to spend on defense is simply reinforced. Thank you.
Right.
Well, maybe if I could, Kaya, just come back. So, obviously beyond the financial sacrifice for, in a context where at least, when I retired from the Canadian Forces, spending on national defense at the levels that we were spending at 1.1% of GDP still represented 25% of the government's discretionary spending. And so when you kind of look at it from the perspective of where the financial means is going to come from and how it's going to be sustained, it's going to have to come from either program reduction, finding new revenues, growing the economy. And so, I think the financial sacrifice is one where it may mean that Canadians have to get used to, and youth have to get used to, maybe not having as a great government investment in other sectors that Joel just talked to. I think the other aspect of sacrifice, of course, is when we kind of look at countries, and I know a chapter in the book talks a little bit about Taiwan, but if you live in Poland or Ukraine or in any of the states that currently have a long and sort of history with Russia, that the ideas of really a whole of society defense. And so whether it be in terms of civil defense, whether it be willingness to serve and national service, I think Canadians haven't been called to really get involved. We have a small professional military, even smaller reserve force. And I think in order for Canada to really protect what we've got, I think we need to have a new kind of sense of national service and contribution. And it's not all about me as an individual, it's about our responsibilities, which is really what Narendra was getting at in his comments as well. I think it's our sense of what are my responsibilities, not just my rights and my freedoms, but rather what are my responsibilities as a citizen to protect Canada and to do whatever is required in the future to really contribute to making sure that our own sovereignty is guaranteed. So I think that there's many ways to serve. Certainly, I know the Canadian Forces has a very difficult challenge of growing the force to the levels that it really needs to be able to do all of the missions that it requires. That's one way of certainly serving, but there's many other ways, including in the civil defense side and taking care of domestic emergencies, where I do think that there's a time right now for Canadians to get involved in all of this and not sit on the sidelines and just expect others to do it for them. So that's a little bit of what I've got in the back of my mind with respect to the sacrifices that are required.
Thank you both.
I noticed, I think today there's a letter to in the Globe and Mail about Engage Canada, which is getting young people involved in some kind of national service. And so we're seeing that talk of mobilization as well, which somewhat takes us by surprise, I would think, in the context of today when we see this happening. We've had a lot of questions come in from the audience, and I think it's time we did turn to the audience and tackle some of their interests and concerns. And I'm going to blend a few of the questions together, and it'll be open to all the panel members to weigh in if you so choose. I think the first one I'll go with is to the higher level, the whole idea of a grand strategy for a country. So we know that we had a national security policy here in Canada that was put out in 2000 before. We've had a load of policies come out, defense policies, foreign policies of one kind or another, Arctic strategies in between, and here we are in 2026. And the calls perhaps for a national security strategy, which I think the government did say they were going to do in our North Strong and Free, our 2024 defense policy, but we've not seen anything yet. So this idea, this notion that we need a grand strategy, yes or no. And then coming around to Narendra's comments, as part of this grand strategy, if we decide to do this, our new national story would be part of it. But who's writing that national story, and what would be even the first steps to writing a new national story for us? So there's a few things in there to talk about, and so I'll open the floor to our panel members. Who would like to jump in first? Okay, I'll go with Narendra. I'll go with Chuck. Please start us off in this conversation, and then we'll go to Narendra and then to Joel.
So personally, the biggest problem I see is the definition of what a grand strategy is, because it depends on who you ask. And so most people would argue that that's a governmental policy problem, and I would agree. But again, defining it is the hard part. I think in a Canadian context, it should probably come from either the Prime Minister's office or Privy Council, or a combination. But who should write that? I mean, I've been watching the questions, and I see that somebody disagrees with Narendra. Personally, I agree with Narendra. But I think people are looking for something that isn't possible. It isn't a question, and I don't think, Narendra, when you weigh in, you can correct me if I've misunderstood you. I don't think Narendra is saying that somebody has to write our national story. That's not what's happening. Canada is a country that is not unique in that, but it is rare. Because if you look at countries in Europe, they are both countries and nations. We are a country that is a collection of nations, and we're designed that way. And so how we write our national story is collectively, and it changes day by day. In the same way that if you're painting a picture, that picture changes day by day. You may have an idea of what you want the end picture to look like, but over the course of the year or two that it takes to paint this giant picture, it'll change slowly, sometimes fast, other times. So I think if we're looking for a simple solution to such a complex problem, we're going to be disappointed. I think we need to learn to live in a state of flux as long as we're moving positively forward, which I believe this current Prime Minister, this current government is doing. Some people won't be happy with how fast or slow, but I think it's moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Chuck. Oh, Narendra, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck, and thanks for the question. When I use the word story, it is in a very normative sense of the term. And that is obviously a very central question: who will write it, who will author it? Because a national story cannot be announced from a podium or drafted by a committee or even sold as a branding exercise. That is something else. That is broadly in a rhetorical space. A national story is like the public argument through which a country imagines and learns what it owes, what it remembers, what it repairs, what it defends, and what burdens it is prepared to carry together. It is not a slogan. It is a test of political maturity. Who writes it? In one sense, everyone. Everyone does. Everyone is a contributor to this larger narrative, so to say. Be it indigenous nations or Quebec immigrants or regions, cities, workers, artists, schools, courts, parliament. I mean, everyone, the stakeholders, endless. Like it's not a kind of a singular kind of a domain. But it does not write itself. That's the catch. It needs institutions capable of holding disagreements in public. The first step is honesty. Canada has to admit that its existing story is incomplete. The familiar language of decency, moderation, diversity, good governance is not false. I'm not suggesting that. But it is no longer sufficient. It does not adequately answer indigenous sovereignty, Quebec issue, Alberta alienation, climate, energy together, but our vulnerability besides the US or the sacrifices of a plural country may ask of its citizens. So it's like the ask is tremendous here. And this is where I would distinguish it from the notion of liberation, like distinguish liberation from emancipation. We didn't have some great liberation movement, collectively speaking. Yes, we know the history. It's not like we don't. But it's a patchwork of nations brought together. And so liberation, when it is a case of national liberations and their liberation names injury, it seeks release from a domination or exclusion. While in case of emancipations, they ask who gets to author the world that follows. So there's a kind of a subsequent phase. For Canada, maybe reconciliation, multiculturalism cannot just remain only a matter of recognition. They have to become the questions of shared authorship. And so the first move is from recognition to obligation. And Canada has become good at recognizing this difference, but it is less confident in saying what those differences owe one another within a shared political home, something which I alluded earlier. And that is where the new story must begin, not with sameness, but with obligation. And a national story worth having would say, we are not one people because we share one origin. We are a political community because we accept certain burdens together. Treaty, climate transitions, plural belonging, sovereignty, the defense of democratic life in a harsher world, all of this. That is the story Canada now needs, not a comforting story, but a demanding one. And this is a broader endeavor of historians, political people engaged in political thought, but as much as everyday people, because fundamentally and in a philosophical sense, it is about defining the political subjectivity of Canadians. If somebody asks me what, like an example, I mean, one of the ready-made example, if I may put it in that sense of the term, it's a Massey report. Massey report was one story written, and to distinguish, it had many objectives, but let's say to distinguish between what Canada is and what America is, within the larger North American thing. Of course, we know the nitty-gritties of that report, and how to protect the so-called idea of Canada itself. And so I think these are the broader kind of underpinnings of such a prospective endeavor where we talk about writing that national story.
Narendra, and Bill, over to you.
Well, I've become a grand strategy skeptic. I partially agree with Hal Brands that grand strategy gives discipline to foreign and defense policy. But if you see grand strategy as bringing together all the elements of the country toward one purpose, and that means the military and the economic. If you just take China, for example, on the one hand, Canadians very much enjoy buying cheap consumer goods produced in China, Canadians and Americans. If you want to ask for sacrifice, stop doing that, because where does that money go? It goes to China's to help it build up its military. And then we say, oh, China's built up its military. We have to build up ours. So it's a never-ending. It goes. It never ends. I think that we have to meet each political decision on its merits, and there's no strategy that will solve it. The other thing is, and I think it's Sutherland, R.J. Sutherland said, there is no such thing as a distinct Canadian strategy. You can look for it, but you can't find it because we have a strategy of alliance. And so going through the effort of writing a grand strategy, I think would be fruitless. Let me say one other thing, and comes back to the question that we discussed earlier. There was an article in the New York Times a few weeks ago, which noted that heretofore, when international tournaments were held in Canada, you could have as many people rooting for the visiting team as for the Canadian team. This is what multiculturalism is. This time, there appears to be more Canadianism involved. But still, if you want to write a national story, that seems to undermine it. But as far as a grand strategy, I think we've done very well without one.
Joel, Guy, did you want to weigh in at this point?
Well, I guess one of my early reflections in the article I wrote, or in the chapter I wrote, was that we don't need a grand new vision for our armed forces. We have a strategic reality that I think is enduring, right? So I think that in the first instance, I guess to Joel's point, we can look for something different, but I think our geographic reality and our relationship with the United States and our Euro-Atlantic history ties us in ways in which, I think our choices, there's choices still to be made, but I don't think having a grand strategy will necessarily provide us that guiding light that's going to make everything easy for us. So what I would say is that let's look at foreign policy and not having a foreign policy and what some of the implications are for that. If I kind of look at it from a defense perspective, we want to make sure that our efforts are being lined up in a way which is reinforcing our diplomatic efforts. And you can look at that using our attaches. And I know, Chris, you have personal experience in this kind of field, given your own kind of background, but using our attaches to promote Canada's defense industry. That was kind of verboten in the past, never used before in the past. And I think that there's some rationale to make sure that our efforts that we've got across all of the national security institutions, including national defense and foreign policy, is aligned in a way that they are currently not. And so I'm all for alignment, and whatever we would want to put into place that would help with that, I think would be useful. Having said that, I'm also mindful of the fact that in the last couple of years that we've had a number of defense policies, from strong, secure, engaged to our more strong and free. And I understand that the national security strategy is ready. It's out there. I believe that there's actually a new defense policy, which is also prepared. That's out there. And I'm a lot less interested in those documents than I am in actually delivering on what we've already said we need to do. And so when I kind of look at it from the perspective of implementing, these kind of policy documents or strategies, I think that's where we really fail, is we don't kind of follow up on the ambition that we've set out for ourselves. And so, where do I land, I guess, at this point is I think we've got enough thinking about what Canada needs to do in this changing world. Now let's just get on with it, and let's keep moving forward. We're going to do policy through the actions, not through kind of more policy pronouncements, is kind of what I'm thinking a little bit about.
Good. Okay, I see your hand up. But Guy, can I do a hot pursuit with you on that, based on some of the questions we've had? Because moving forward, we're getting all these new capabilities. In some ways, I feel like we're still stuck in the same sort of things that we've always done. We've stepped away so much globally? And I'm thinking about our contributions to the UN, which one of the questions is pointed up about where are we with the United Nations? Why are we sort of absent from Haiti, for example? Troops from Kenya are providing the bulk of the forces there. And, is there room as we're moving forward to, should we be speaking, expanding our footprint? I noticed we've resurrected our embassy in Zambia in the last week or so after being absent for 15 years. Where is this nexus? It seems to be missing.
Well, I think part of the answer clearly is capacity. We ultimately have been struggling just to sustain, say, on the land forces side, the footprint that we have in Latvia, and let alone doing anything else. And so, while we can take care of domestic operations and fighting fires and responding to floods, even that comes with a cost, because when we're doing that, we're actually not doing the fundamental foundational training for, really the missions that the Canadian Armed Forces should be prepared to do at all times. So I think that the answer, both this Chief of Defence Staff, the past Chief of Defence Staff Moynier, spoke about the fact that it's a regular force of 85,000, and we got to grow it. And if we had that kind of capacity, and if the readiness of the force was at levels that clearly we're not at today in terms of our personnel readiness and our capability, equipment, logistical footprint, we'd be able to do a lot more in the world. So, and I think we ought to. I think Haiti, for example, is a good case in point. I think that Canada could certainly have contributed to that mission, and I know that part of the resistance to it was really just the lack of capacity that we had to undertake that mission. So I'd certainly be a favor for using the capabilities that we've got. I think people who are in the Canadian Forces would also want to be contributing to international peace and security wherever those opportunities were. And so from that perspective, I think growing the force is part and parcel of how we actually get about doing that.
Thanks, Guy. And over to you, Charles.
Yeah, so many ideas. I'm going to disagree slightly with my previous professor. Most of what I know about political theory I learned from Joel. But I think when we talk about grand strategy, we focus too often on external to Canada. The grand strategy, by definition, again, takes me back. I'm a fundamentalist. You can have a strategy, but your grand strategy is supposed to be all-encompassing. And I think we have one. Maybe it isn't well stated, maybe it isn't well understood. I always, in my travels around the world, both in uniform and as an academic, um, I would say people saw us as the friendly nation. We were, we wanted to be engaged with everyone. We wanted to be a trade nation with everyone. We wanted to be friendly towards anyone and everyone that would be friendly towards us. I've always said that we have no natural enemies. And if we weren't sitting next to the world hegemon, the United States, I dare say we wouldn't have any enemies. We have enemies because of who our friends are, and we sort of accept that because we want their friendship, we want their trade, we want those relationships. So, and I've been following the questions, and I've answered a couple privately or in writing, but one of the questions was, should we be busier in the United Nations peacekeeping? And my answer is yes, but not yet. We cannot get back into peacekeeping and helping the UN solve all of the world's problems until we rebuild our force. So, you don't go into an Olympic competition without training for 4 years first. Give us a few years to rebuild all of our institutions, which we have let slide. And then, by all means, as Guy has said, um, we can do more around the world, but not immediately. That's too much for us to ask.
And Joel, over to you.
You know, one would think that hard power should be used to support hard interests. Our hard interests are our security interests and our economic interests, not necessarily in that order. Contributing to the UN is discretionary. It's not hard. It's not something we have to do. It's something we may like to do. And I think you have to go back as what will in the early 1990s, we contributed to a UN force in Bosnia, which had to get out of the way. And then we launched a NATO force at the time. So, if it's hard interest, you use hard power. And if it's not, then you have discretion, but you can only do discretionary things when you have a surplus of capabilities. You'd be difficult to identify what hard interest do we have in Haiti. It's a terrible situation. We wish it were better, but what is the Canadian hard interest there?
So I guess going to that question vis-a-vis Haiti, we're seeing what's happening in the United States with a Haitian population there, and I noticed last year and this year so far, Haitian requests for political refugee status in Canada have climbed to be they're number one now. So we are seeing some some things happening on that file. But as you rightfully point out, we've stepped away in many respects from being on the ground. Yeah. Look, we've had so many questions come in. I've done a lot of webinars, and I know you folks have too. I often struggle to even have one or two questions, and we've had a lot come in. There are a few things I want to try to do to wrap up, and Kai is actually going to wrap up for us. I've got a quick few comments, which I hope will help with some of the questions that came in. And then I know I know that you've been looking at the questions coming in, so I want to give every panel member a couple of minutes just to sort of weigh in on anything that struck them in the Q&A that has been going on. The first thing I would say is I'm an immigrant. I came to Canada when I was 10 years old from England, from Bournemouth. And last night, if you'd been with me, you would have seen me having several heart attacks as we played Mexico and won. It was so stressful. But if Canada was playing England in a soccer match, I would support Canada for sure, right? As much as I love Harry Kane. And I think, I'm stuck in that situation that many people that come to Canada face. And Narendra, when I was reading your chapter, I did ask myself, what is that one thing? Is there anything that we share? All the people that come to Canada, yes, we know the Indigenous people have been here for a very long time, but all of those people that have come here over the centuries, from one place or another, what do we share in common? And I could only come up with this, and that we've always, I think we've seen Canada as a means to a better life for us and our children. We share that one thing. I'd say 99% do, that they see Canada because of what it is as a country, what it's become. We share this, and that was that one thing that I could come up with. It's not terribly intellectual, I know. And then it struck me as how much Putin and Trump have played into the Canadian story. Most recently, with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and how he made us look at ourselves. And as somebody pointed out in the Q&A, how other countries, and Europe especially, have been forced to look at themselves and who they are and what the state of their security and defense is, and how Trump has forced us to look at ourselves. If there's one good thing that he's done, it's to force us to look at ourselves. And then I turn to the submarines and how lackadaisical perhaps we have been as Canadians. You can go back to the 1987 white paper and you'll find in there that we committed to buying up to 10 to 12 nuclear powered submarines in 1987. And here we are in 2026, finally making an announcement. Yes, they're not nuclear powered, I know, but here we are. this speaks to the fact that we've been, forced to take a hard look at our own defense and security and who we are as well going forward. Anyway, this is, those are a few things that have struck me from the Q&A that's come in, the questions and your thoughts. And I'd like to turn it back to the panel members to do a couple of minutes of wrap up from what they've seen and heard today. And I'll go through the same order we started. And Chuck, over to you to kick this off.
Thanks, Chris. I'll be brief. I just wanted to show my appreciation to all the questions, lots of great questions. And I wanted to say that in putting this book together, we weren't looking to solve anything. We were looking to start the discussions across the country very much like we're having right now. So I think in that respect, we've already succeeded. We hope that all of the people who buy this book or get it from the library or read it will begin this type of discussion. And it's exactly because we've got guys like Guy and Narendra and Joel that we can reach out to expertise that will allow us to move the yardstick. And I I laughed when you talked about soccer because I, like you, I'm an immigrant, came to Canada when I was 2 years old. I don't have that problem this year because Italy didn't make it. But yeah, when Italy plays in the World Cup, up until now, it's never been a problem because Canada's never made it to a knockout round. But yeah, obviously I root for Canada. I fly the flag. I'm wearing my Royal Military College shirt today. So I just want to offer gratitude for all of this. Thanks, Chris.
Chuck and Guy, I'll head to you.
Well, I'm really enthusiastic on one hand about the newfound interest in matters of defense and security, because I think heretofore has always been kind of a very small, narrow group of folks who have worked internationally, who have been involved in these issues and have seen the need and have seen us kind of sleepwalking in the world and really not holding up our side of the burden sharing of our alliances. And so I think that's a very positive kind of development. The unfortunate thing is the world is turning in a very dark direction, and the fact is that we need to do this. And so, I think it's good news on one side. It's too bad that we have to do it because of what we're seeing develop and the fracturing of kind of the norms that we've expected, and as the Prime Minister kind of characterized, the rupture that we've seen. So, the fundamental assumptions, back to what Narendra talked a little bit about, that underpinned our sense of Canada in the world and the security we had, I think all force us now to look at what are we prepared to do, and I think this is an intergenerational kind of problem. We need to get involved, and I think that has been something that's been quite refreshing as well, is to see all of the newfound interest in these issues to try to better understand it. And so from that perspective, I think this book, Fulfilling the Promise, I think maybe we weren't trying to solve all the problems there, Chuck, but hopefully people do have a chance to kind of pick it up, read it, and think about some of the opportunities we have and some of the ways that we can confront those challenges. And I know that on the Canadian Forces side, all of the chapters that are written here about the services, I think are definitely worth folks having a look at. So for that, Chuck, once again, thanks for including me, and Chris, to you and Kaya for the opportunity this afternoon.
Thank you, Guy, and Narendra, over to you.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks for the questions. I'm sorry I was not able to answer each and every, which I would love to. One Zoom session or one such conversation is never enough. It at the most generates further questions. And as long as it generates questions, I'm really happy about it. Agreeing, disagreeing is just part of the game. And I think that should not stop us, either in terms of conversation or in terms of even coming to the idea of, let's say, an agreement or a consensus, so to say. Mm, I wish I was exchanging some messages. I wish I was just thinking about what is that which defined or which a perception of Canada in the world. I think it is always, I come back to that little patch on the backpacks or on clothing that most of the tourists or Canadian travelers carry with them, and proudly showing around. And I wish one could have created some kind of an index with the use of that badge, which would lead to giving some kind of, in a very popular cultural sense, what is this kind of give and take vis-a-vis that symbolism from the outside world, vis-a-vis the idea of Canada itself, imagined, very abstract, whatever it is. And I think I still, even today, I think the perception is still largely positive. We do come across, proudly, I have come across so many people saying, oh, I am Canadian, announcing. And when you announce yourself also to be Canadian, and I mean, it's a wonderful embrace. And so I think it's more of that hope, as well as also what something I think, if you may allow, Guy, as Guy just alluded to in a private chat, the idea of just society, which Senior Trudeau talked about, invoked in a way. Some grand, not grand strategy, this grand narrative for a nation wherein people hook onto, peg to, I think that is something still what is amiss for us. And I think that's where I would leave this conversation. And I really look forward to continuing in whatever avenues and forms. I'll definitely try to make myself available should there be a need. And thanks, Chuck, again for inviting me to contribute to the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Narendra. And I will say to the audience, if you do want to contact any of the panel members here today, you can always reach out to me. I'll put my email address in the chat in a second, and I'll connect you. And so, Joel, over to you.
Well, I'm the grandson of immigrants who came from Russia. When my grandparents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, they got a plaque from the Prime Minister. And my grandfather called me over and said, you see, if I stayed in Russia, the Tsar would not have sent me a plaque. And that was all that was important for him. I think Canadians are well liked around the world, but we have to understand that countries also like power and wealth as well. And that's something we have to cope with. So I'd like to thank Chuck for involving me in this, and you, Chris, for making it all possible. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. And look, you've reminded me of a little thing that happened here when General Wayne Eyre visited us a few years ago and spoke at a CIC event. And one of the students from UVic and from Nigeria, a Nigerian student, asked if he could have a selfie with the Chief of Defense Staff. And of course, the Chief of Defense Staff said yes. And the student afterwards said to me, well, that would never have happened in Nigeria. So that does speak, I think, to the country in some aspects. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn over the floor to Kaya, who's going to just do a bit of a quick summary, and then we'll say our farewells.
Thanks, Chris. So the world Canada was founded on no longer exists. For decades, our country enjoyed a rare luxury of security without much sacrifice. That era is over, and today's panel has asked, seriously, whether Canada is willing to do what it takes to matter in the new global order. First, Canada is dangerously underprepared for a world defined by great power rivalry, a more transactional United States, and a rising China. Threats no longer announce themselves at the border, and the comfortable assumptions that my parents' generation inherited no longer hold. Second, across the armed forces, the gap between what Canada's military needs to do and what it is currently equipped to do is stark. A Navy that is challenged to project beyond our coastline, an Air Force that needs rebuilding, and an Army caught in a cycle of promised modernization that never quite delivers. Third, is there still a shared we in Canada? A national identity coherent enough to sustain a serious foreign policy? My generation's answer, I think, is yes. We just define it differently. It's not shared by ethnicity or heritage. Instead, it is by the very fact of our diversity. The question is whether that we can be turned into strategy. Fourth, Canada must rebuild its military, strengthen its institutions, and use its high levels of education to defend its sovereignty and act with credibility on the world stage. As Prime Minister Carney said at his Davos speech, middle powers must act together because if you're not at the table, you are on the menu. That is the challenge that fulfilling the promise of Canada puts to us and to the future generation that will have to answer it. So I wanted to give another thank you to our panel members for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for watching. And please visit the CIC website and find out more about our organization if you're not a member, and please buy the book. I read it, and it's a phenomenal work. So thank you, everyone.
I have my copy behind me, and I'll just add my thanks to the panel members and to the audience. There were a lot of conversations happening behind the scenes and also here, and it's been tremendous to have this discussion today, and also tremendous, I think, to end with Kaya and her comments, because to be frank, you will be the one that will either be in some embassy, some CEO somewhere, or in one of those new submarines telling everybody where to send it. So it's to you that this book is also, and to our younger populations, that it's directed as well. So on that note, everyone, thank you so much for spending the time with us today, and Chuck to having the inspiration, and Phil also to having this, and for all of the authors that put so much effort into making this book happen. And on that note, I will bid you adieu, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.